Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is my Forbes colleague, senior editor Alex Knapp. Alex, thanks so much for joining me.
Brittany, it's great to be here.
I'm really lucky in the last 2 months in my role. I've had many conversations regarding DOGE and budget cuts on everything it's impacting, like Social Security, like federal workers, veterans, the federal government, politics, and everything in between. You are our leading expert in everything from science and healthcare. So, to start off the conversation, what is DOGE? What are budget cuts doing to these industries?
That's a great question, and the answer is a lot. Initially, nearly as soon as the Trump administration got going, they implemented a freeze on a lot of federal contracts and federal spending. That immediately, and there was a communications freeze as well, which kind of immediately caused a cascading impact, delaying funds getting to essential research, like looking for cures for cancer and things of that nature. We've also seen cuts to other agencies like the National Science Foundation, the Department of Energy, and then USAID, our main source of foreign aid, is also a big and important institution for a lot of biomedical research and biomedical spending. And the impacts there have also caused a lot of issues. I think most significantly with USAID, apart from the impact it's having around the world, where people who were able to get access to medication suddenly don't have it anymore. Just right here in the United States, those cuts have forced Johns Hopkins University, which is one of our premier scientific research institutions, they're going to lay off nearly 2,000 people. As a result from the USAID cuts alone, there may be more, as the NIH is promising a reduction in force plan and freezing spending on different types of research, including cancer research. There was one scientist I know who runs a pediatric cancer research lab that's being closed. And that's just the immediate impact.
When you hear things like cures for cancer, a pediatric cancer center being closed, what is the response from the Trump administration? Were these intended consequences? I mean, what's the reasoning behind this?
Well, there's a few different things. I mean, one, there was a spending freeze from the get-go. The idea, I guess, being that they wanted to have the new administration come in and look at things before decisions were made on spending. But also with a lot of the cuts, there doesn't seem to be a lot of necessary rhyme or reason. As we've seen, there's been a lot of backpedaling, where the administration's fired people and then immediately been like, whoops, the next day, like trying desperately to hire them back. In some cases they have, in some cases they haven't. People are just staying quit because of the uncertainty and everything that's happening in these federal agencies. And that alone can have some cascading and rippling consequences. The other side of it is the president's order around, for a long time, the federal government has been trying to desegregate away from our racial past, our racist past. And in the name of getting rid of diversity, equity, and inclusion programs that were a part of decades of tradition, there's lists of forbidden words you can't include in grant applications anymore, and grants are being cut if it's seen that they have a tinge of DEI. Of course, the challenge of this is, first of all, equity is incredibly important in when you're talking about healthcare, because different drugs affect different people differently. And so if you want to get people the right medication, you have to study these things. But the second thing is that these cuts that they're making are so, there's a clear ignorance of how science works, because there are terms of art like bias that you use in measuring statistics. That's a red flag word. You can't use the word bias, even though it's a term of art in statistics. These are the kinds of things that aren't being thought through and thought about that are causing people to lose jobs, research to get cut off, clinical studies for medicines not being able to happen. Additionally, these freezes on communications prevented sharing of data with industry partners. The federal government and different businesses have very intertwined relationships. and particularly in healthcare. And so they weren't getting data for several weeks. The federal government wasn't doing patent work for several weeks, which meant that a lot of agreements where the federal government licenses patents to businesses as a way to generate money for the federal government, it wasn't happening.
As our editor who covers healthcare, who covers science, what are some of these rippling consequences that you're talking about? And what are some of the other ones that might be unintended? Like you said, the term bias, how it's used in one way in science, another way in the Trump administration. What are some of these unintended consequences?
Sure. I think the biggest unintended consequences, this is the America First administration. And where the United States has been a premier, one of the foundations of our power, of our economic strength, of our political strength, has been our scientific and technological superiority. And that comes because the United States spends more on research and development than any other country. But at the rate these cuts are happening, we are almost certainly going to be overtaken by China within just the next few years if these things continue at the same rate. The cuts in personnel also have a cascading and rippling effect because those are people who are no longer probably going to go into research. A lot of pure research happens in academia. If those positions get cut, and a lot of them are dependent on the federal government. The federal government provides about 55% of all funding for academic research in this country. So if those positions get cut, those people are going to move on to other jobs. And they might make great financial analysts or high school teachers and be very good in those roles, but they're not doing the basic research that undergirds American superiority. And to give you, just think about this, Silicon Valley, which is home to trillions of dollars of economic activity, all stems from scientific research in developing the internet, in developing artificial intelligence, in developing semiconductors. It all comes from the federal government. Elon Musk, who derives a significant portion of his wealth from SpaceX would not be where it is without billions of dollars in research funding from NASA, which helped to develop its Falcon 9 and Dragon rockets to deliver both cargo and crew to the International Space Station. Federal spending on research undergirds the tech industry. Without it, we're going to develop things slower. We are going to lose our technological edge to other players, and it's going to make American businesses less competitive with the rest of the world.
China, you're saying our adversary would be able to have more of a competitive edge on the United States in these fields because of this funding that's being cut. So what does this mean for healthcare, for science in the United States going forward? Does it look radically different?
I do think it looks radically different. I think we're going to see a significant slowdown in the pace of innovation and the pace of progress, especially when it comes to basic research. But even more immediately, a lot of research funding goes to support research hospitals, which in many communities is the hospital. And if those institutions have to cut doctors, if they can't develop treatments, you're going to see, especially in rural areas where there's not a lot of access to healthcare, a rippling effect there too, where suddenly people aren't going to have access to healthcare. They're going to have to drive further to get to the hospital. Specialty centers for children, in particular, might be in danger because of this, because again, federal funding undergirds so much of the infrastructure of healthcare in this country. So you're going to have an immediate effect just there. But if you look at it too, a lot of universities depend on the federal government to keep going. That research money is what keeps the lights on. In a lot of communities, a lot of college towns, that university is the center hub of economic activity. In some communities, it's the biggest employer. When they have to lay off hundreds, thousands of people, that doesn't just impact the university, it doesn't just impact research, it impacts those local businesses, the restaurants, the small businesses, the gas stations, like all of those things. That's where you start to see these ripple effects moving on, and you're going to see a decline in economic activity overall.
I hear just how serious this situation is from you, especially when it comes to hospitals in rural areas, because if one shut down, the next one Unless you live in a big city, I mean, there's one hospital per community, really. So, does this mean for the everyday American, aside from that, both immediately and in the long term?
Well, I think immediately you can look forward, there's going to be, higher unemployment, more competition for jobs. Healthcare is going to be more expensive and harder to access. And in the long term, American businesses are going to be less competitive. We're going to be overtaken by our rivals. And uh, I think you'll also see, I think you'll also see a lot of the smartest, most innovative talent uh, go away from the United States. Historically speaking, we've attracted a lot of immigrant talent in particular, where and a lot of some of our best innovations have come from immigrants. Immigrants have founded a disproportionate number of our biggest businesses. They're going to go places where they're more welcome, where there's more support for research and funding, where there's more support for immigration. And not just folks from out of the United States. I think you'll also see more native-born Americans look for brighter waters, places where they can get jobs, where they can get research funding. And so that's going to displace innovation once more. There have been some universities in France, for example, that have started to open up and incentivize American researchers to go to them. And they're overwhelmed by applications right now. They're delaying when they're making decisions because they have so many applications to go through. So you're seeing a brain drain from the United States to the rest of the world.
I know that we said earlier in the conversation, you're seeing Elon Musk, you're seeing DOGE sometimes say, we're not perfect, we make mistakes. Sometimes they cut too much and they say oopsies and then rehire. Is that what we're going to see, do you think, in science fields, in healthcare fields, as we see some of these effects play out?
I mean, I definitely think that you will see, as people realize stuff is breaking, right? That people will try to come back. But I've heard from scientists already tell me that they're transitioning to other careers, and because right now you can't rely on the federal government as a partner anymore. So I think that universities too, with their budgets, are going to be more conservative. They're going to try to be less reliant on federal funding. So even if some of those pots of money come back, people may not be as eager to take them. And again, I think they'll probably keep their budgets trimmer. They'll keep their staffs trimmer. Even if you start to see people getting hired back, not everyone's going to come back, and not everyone's going to trust that they can rely on the federal government as a partner, especially when they're not just cutting spending, they're canceling contracts. So you sign a piece of paper with the government, trusting them to honor their end of the agreement, and they don't. And so why would you contract with the federal government for this research? That's another challenge that you're going to see. And I think continually you're going to see a slowdown regardless, just because of that loss of trust factor.
You've been covering the science-related DOGE cuts, which is really a piece in the larger DOGE puzzle. From your perspective, when it comes to science, when it comes to healthcare, what do you think is missing from this conversation when you're talking about DOGE at large?
I think what's missing from the puzzle is I think there's not a great understanding of how intertwined federal spending is with our businesses and with our industry. So to take an example, U.S. Department of Agriculture provides a lot of support services for farmers. They help identify invasive pests to make sure that they don't, destroy a whole crop. They help farmers breed more resilient crops in their research labs. So that's just even one segment. You wouldn't think of farming as being like a huge, that reliant on government, or B, that reliant on science. But actually, it's very advanced technically. And one reason why the U.S. is dominant in agriculture is because of the strong support we get from the Department of Agriculture and the staff scientists there and the support services there. And that's just one example. But you'll see this intertwined nature of the government and industry all throughout the country. It's part and parcel of how our economy is built. And that interdependence, when you look at the DOGE cuts, look, I'm not saying that every federal dollar is spent wisely necessarily, or that there's any issue with, trying to audit these things and make sure that there isn't waste, or there isn't abuse, or programs aren't working. Maybe they do need to be shut down. All that's just fine, but that's not what DOGE is doing. DOGE is playing a game of Jenga with the federal government, basically seeing how many pieces they can take out without collapsing the whole order of our economy. And that's what I think is dangerous. And if you read about, I would recommend Character Limit by my former colleague Ryan Mack and his partner Kate Conger, which talks about how Elon approached his takeover of Twitter. It's very similar to what he's doing at DOGE. He fired people, he cut money, he cut systems, he stopped paying leases, and he did all these things. Something broke, then you try to fix it. But a lot of it didn't work. Like, Twitter is a shell of its former self. It's shedding users. Its revenues are significantly lower than it used to be. Its valuation is almost 2/3 less than what it used to be. And he's following that same roadmap for the federal government, and I don't think it's prudent. And I think you're going to see a lot of long-term damage as a result.
And in my conversations about DOGE, that's one of the criticisms I get is, hey, we're not saying there's no waste, there's no abuse, there's no fraud. We want to find that. We want to cut that out, but that's not what's happening. There's a hatchet being used instead of a scalpel, and they don't appreciate what seems to be his willy-nilly approach in cutting things. And the things that you're talking about are largely nonpartisan. Anything from farming, cure for cancer, of different biomedical research. So what specifically are you looking out for next?
I think what I'm looking out for again is just some of the ripple effects. Like, are these cuts going to stand? Some of these are still proposed and not implemented yet, right? So what actually gets implemented? Will department heads start to kind of wrest control of their own agencies back away from Elon Musk? And I think we've seen a lot of pushback from the cabinet secretaries and other agency heads against some of these cuts. We're starting to see pushback from industry against some of these cuts. So really is, how far does it end up going? And also whether Congress, a lot of these things being cut are mandated by statute. And the Constitution doesn't give the president the authority to just not spend on something that Congress tells him to spend. And so, will Congress push back on some of this? These are all the things that we're kind of watching out for. Also interested to see how some of the gaps get filled. So interestingly enough, so the pharma company Recursion, I wrote about a program that they're implementing, which is they're building an accelerator for companies that had small business grants in the biotech field that had frozen or the contract got rescinded. They're doing an accelerator for some of these to try to fund those. And so where can industry fill the gaps? Probably not completely, but I'm interested to see where those gaps get filled, and then how other organizations and other industry groups kind of organize to fill in the gaps that the government's leaving behind as well, is also an interesting story.
That's a really interesting point, and I had a really long conversation with Congressman John Larson about Social Security and DOGE last week, and he said what Elon Musk and DOGE are trying to do essentially are make the Social Security Administration basically unworkable, and then that he will privatize Social Security. Do you see that similarly, that they're trying to make science or healthcare related industries at all unusable, unworkable at the federal government level, so then they get privatized?
Well, it's an interesting question. I don't necessarily know how deliberately it is. I'm sure, based on some of the things Elon Musk said, that he does think a lot of these things can be taken private. I think that the challenge there again is just kind of a lack of understanding. You don't always know when you're talking about basic research, where's there the upside? When you look at where businesses spend money on R&D, it's on basically refining technology so we can scale it and take it to market. But that basic research that leads to some of these grand innovations, that's the kind of stuff that there's not, the profit in it might be 40 years down the road. That it was a study of Gila monster venom in the 80s, basic research funded by the federal government, that ended up with discovery of certain hormones that led to discovery of certain other hormones that led to Ozempic. But, that first step in the chain, that unprofitable, we're going to fund this basic knowledge, that's where the government is really the only major player. I mean, there's only, nonprofits don't have the resources, universities don't have the resources. Private industry, try explaining to your shareholders that we're funding this research because we hope 40 years down the road something comes out of it.
I mean, that is not a good pitch at all to an investor. But Alex, I know one thing based on this conversation is that there is a lot that remains to be seen, the consequences of this. And I'm really going to lean on your expertise in the next 4 years, at least navigating this. And so I hope you come back on for many, many conversations to come. Alex Knapp, thanks for your time.
Great. Thanks for having me.